So welcome everybody. My name is Sofia Perez, and I'm a member of the Center for the Study of Europe here at Boston University. And today it is my very great pleasure to introduce our guest, Konstantinos Myrodias, am I saying it correctly? Who has written this phenomenal new book, which I'm going to hold up for everyone, and has just come out, correct? Which is on the political economy of the Eurozone's rollercoaster, with a particular focus on the cases of Greece and Portugal from the global financial crisis to the COVID-19, and including the response to the COVID-19 crisis. Konstantinos is a lecturer at King's College London, specifically in the Department of European and International Studies. Thank you. And by training, an economist, correct? And so I wanted to just read to you the blurb from, is it here? No, I just saw it somewhere else. That was okay. Okay, from Robert Wade, who is a professor of political economy at the London School of Economics. And he has to say about this new book that Dr. Myrodias makes an important contribution by showing how the response to the recent crisis solidified Greece and Portugal's subordinate position in the Eurozone. This was part engineered in the interest of Northern European economies, and a dismaying replay of how European colonial states earlier engineered the dependent status of their colonies to boost their own economic growth and political power. The book has a preface by Paul de Grove, another very important contributor to the study of the Eurozone. And I'm very glad to have had an opportunity to read it, and I encourage everyone to do so and to go out and buy it. Okay.
Great, thank you very much,
Yes.
Sophia. So I think that we can start with the presentation. My plan is to say a few things about the book, to discuss the key highlights of the political economy of the Eurozone rollercoaster, and then we can have time to have a discussion about the current economic and political developments. Definitely we have some important developments in the past few months, especially here in the United States, that have affected the global economy, Eurozone as well, substantially. So I'll start with the next slides. So so I'll start by saying a few things about the book. What is this book about, and also what its main contribution. Then I'll talk a little bit about how the Eurozone became, I would say soon after its creation, a major test of economic theories. And then I'll discuss the two different crises, of course the global financial crisis in 2008, and how later on it became a very European crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. So the idea is to see how the Eurozone manage these two crises, and to what extent basically the Eurozone is in a better place to deal with crisis, or basically is more resilient today after all. And of course in the end we will be able to discuss the current challenges we are facing in the Eurozone, but also in global trade. So we can move to second slide. So I would say that the Eurozone goes beyond the current literature on the European affairs. It aims to go more in depth and explain what are the structural dimensions of the crisis, to show basically the sources of uneven development, the sources of the macroeconomic imbalances, and as I said, to what extent the Eurozone is more resilient today after these two crises. The main contribution of the book is definitely that it synthesizes two comparative political economy approaches in order to show the structural aspects, the structural dimensions of this crisis. So I will continue with the next slide. And basically, as I said, the book argues that the Eurozone became a major test of economic theory soon after its creation. And this is because the Eurozone adopted two different crisis management approaches in the past 2 decades. The first one, I would say, that was a more a neoclassical approach that basically was quite, I would say, definitely influential but quite problematic, as I will explain in a minute. And also later on, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it took a different perspective. It used more, I would say, Keynesian crisis style crisis management in order to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically, I would say that the neoclassical economics proved astonishingly influential in 2008 and basically influenced how the European Union institutions, the IMF, basically dealt with the crisis in the Eurozone. So according to this neoclassical reading of the crisis, the main problem in the Eurozone was, first of all, that some countries, especially in Southern Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain, they were living beyond their means, or they were spending more than what they should. So this, according to this approach, basically led to a significant rise of fiscal deficits and public debt in the Southern European periphery. And I would say that this was the primary reason, according to this reading of the crisis, on basically why the Eurozone paid such a high price after the global financial crisis. So the second element of this reading of the crisis was that the wages in Southern Europe, in these countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain, up to some extent Italy, were rising faster than the rest of the Eurozone. So this this made the exports of these economies more expensive and less competitive in the European and international market. So this led gradually to a competitiveness loss in Southern Europe. So according to the neoclassical economic perspective, the solution, or basically the way to deal with the crisis, was austerity. So this presumably would allow these economies to balance their government spending, and also internal devaluation, meaning some measures to reduce the labor cost, to make labor markets more flexible, in order to be able to restore competitiveness, especially export competitiveness. So these were the key assumptions behind the bailout programs, the EU and IMF bailout programs. So let's move to the next.
Did I move that? Yes. I think.
Yes, and I would say that this was, although the neoclassical economics were very influential, at the same time they have been criticized significantly by, especially the austerity policies, significantly by Keynesian economists. So I would say that although the Keynesian perspective was not that influential during the Eurozone crisis in 2008, 2010, later on became very, basically it gained traction later on during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would say that according to this criticism, the problem in the Eurozone was not basically the loss of competitiveness, it was primarily austerity. So basically during the crisis, according to Keynesian economists, the European economies should have spent more. They should have adopted a fiscal expansion policy in order to stimulate demand and allow these economies to recover quickly from the crisis. And definitely there were other criticisms against the role of the European Central Bank, against Jean-Claude Trichet and the policy that had in place, basically the reluctance of the ECB to act as a lender of last resort to boost liquidity across the Eurozone. So I would say that definitely this was the primary debate during the Eurozone crisis. Definitely the neoclassical perspective, the austerity approach, and the Keynesian criticism that basically asking for a more, I would say, demand-driven recovery in these countries. So were these two approaches effective in dealing with the crisis? I would say that both they have been very influential. So the prominent debate was again between neoclassical economics and Keynesian critics. However, I would say, and the book makes the case, that these approaches were quite unproductive in the sense that it failed to explain the deeper sources of the crisis, more the structural dimensions of the crisis. And somehow I would say that they underestimated the source of uneven development, also the diverging growth models, diverging the fact that the economies within the Eurozone were diverging significantly during the crisis. So for this reason, the book takes another approach, a different perspective. It synthesizes two perspectives. The first one is varieties of capitalism, that focuses more on the role of institutions, the role of the firms, the role of the labor markets, industrial relations in different contexts. So basically allow us to understand how economies function in different institutional contexts. And at the same time, it takes some, I would say, demand-side perspective by using the post-Keynesian growth model approach that allow us to understand how macroeconomic policies, fiscal policies, basically affect the direction of growth in different countries. And I would say that based on this synthesis, the book makes an argument that says that in the first decade of the Eurozone, countries in the Eurozone developed different growth models, different types of economies. So this, I would say that some countries, especially in Northern Europe, some prominent examples is Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, they developed an export-led economy, meaning that they were using exports, or they were relying on exports in order to sustain high growth rates. And from the other side, in Northern Europe, we have some countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, that they were relying primarily on domestic demand, on consumption in order to sustain growth. So gradually, the book argues that the Eurozone became a union of different growth models, and I would say also of diverging growth models. And for this reason, when the global financial crisis spread from the United States to Europe, especially the consumption-led economies in Southern Europe were proved to be very vulnerable to the crisis. So let's see what happened during the global financial crisis. First of all, the book argues that the real crisis in the Eurozone started a long time before the outbreak of the global financial crisis. So it says that the economies in the Eurozone diverged extensively before the crisis. And the primary reason behind this trend was that the interest rates, after the creation of the Eurozone, the interest rates, as you can see in this figure here from 2000 until 2007, especially 8, when the global financial crisis started, you can see that the interest rates converged for all European economies, for all Eurozone economies. And I would say that this was quite problematic in the sense that countries, some peripheral countries or weak economies like Greece or Portugal, they were now in a position to borrow money from the capital markets at the same conditions as some high-performing economies like Germany. So this trend proved to be very destabilizing because the low interest rates allowed the consumption-led economies to increase consumption, to spend more, and accumulating, as I will explain, current account deficits, and from the other side allowed the export-led economies to export more in the south. So this created a vicious cycle of these diverging growth models. And as you can see in this second figure, the export-led economies, here you can see Germany and the Netherlands, they sustained very high current account surpluses, trade surpluses. While from the other side, the consumption-led economies, such as Greece, Portugal and Spain, they sustained very high current account deficits. And I would say for this reason, they proved very vulnerable when the crisis hit the Eurozone. So what did the Eurozone did to deal with the crisis? I would say that first of all, countries like Greece and Portugal, they were de facto outside the capital markets, meaning that they were not in a position to continue refinancing their public debts. And basically they signed bailout agreements, bailout programs with the European institutions and the IMF. So basically, as we said, the neoclassical approach says that austerity was needed in order for these economies to recover. And also internal devaluation in order to reduce the labor cost and make their exports more competitive, less expensive and more competitive. So was this somehow a successful approach? The book argues that it was not. Although that, as you can see, these countries, Greece and Portugal, after the crisis 2008, 2009 and 10, they achieved to balance their government spending. I would say that the policies failed to transform these economies to export-led economies or to allow a dynamic recovery in these countries. And
I'm sorry. Sorry.
And as you can see, although they also managed a remarkable trade adjustment, so you can see that with the blue color is Greece and with orange color is Portugal, that these economies managed to decrease their trade deficit after the crisis. The book argues that this was the result of a dramatic collapse of fear of imports because of the austerity policies, rather than because of a dynamic export recovery. So as you will see in the next slide. So basically, as you can see, the exports of these economies, they remained stagnant throughout the period after the crisis. So basically the policies that presumably would transform these economies to export-led economies, basically, as you can see, they failed to do so. So the exports stagnated after the crisis and remained far beyond the other European economies, especially also the export-led economies. Here you can see Germany and Netherlands. So definitely, I would say that these policies were not effective in boosting the export recovery in these countries. And the book makes an analytical, I would say, approach to understand why, basically, although we had this trade adjustment, why, basically, what are the factors that impede an export-led recovery in these countries. And basically it argues that these economies, they have weak and fragmented production bases that basically do not allow them to produce at scale. Also, they have skill shortages in the export sectors, and primarily they produce less competitive products. They produce low added value, low tech products. And I would say this figure illustrates this point in a nice way. So definitely here you can see the exports of high tech products as a share of total exports. So basically you can see here that Greece and Portugal, they are lagging far behind the rest of the European economies. As you can see, the EU average is about 17% and definitely far behind the other export-led economies. So I would say that the overall neoclassical approach, the austerity approach, was definitely counterproductive and definitely failed to transform these economies into a sustainable growth model. And at the same time, the book argues that even politically, the approach that the Eurozone took during the global financial crisis was not very productive, in the sense that the neoclassical and Keynesian debate somehow failed to shed light to the structural dimension of the crisis, to more deep sources of the crisis. And basically it allowed a blame game between the North and the South that basically, I would say that's transform an economic division within the Eurozone between the export-led economies and the consumption-led economies into a political division between the North and the South. So this proved very problematic and still is an important issue in the Eurozone. And as you can see here, also the trust to the European Union has declined dramatically. So you can see with the blue color is the trust to the European Union before the global financial crisis in 2005, and with the orange color is the trust to the European Union after the global financial crisis. You can see that the support of the trust to the EU declined substantially, and not only in economies like Greece and Portugal that basically they implemented harsh austerity policies, but this also was the case in other countries such as Germany, the UK, and also in other countries. So definitely I would say the neoclassical response to the crisis was very problematic.
And this was the cost in terms of trust.
Exactly, and this is something that we still see, especially after the pandemic. So let's now talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic. So definitely the COVID-19 pandemic was not a financial crisis. It was primarily a public health crisis. However, I would say that the way that the governments across the world dealt with the pandemic, especially the lockdown policies, created a new economic crisis. So let's see, as you can see here, there's a comparison between the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see the real GDP growth. So what you can see here is that definitely the COVID-19 pandemic was a deeper, basically caused a deeper recession, and also it was a truly global crisis, in the sense that for the first time, both advanced, emerging, and developing economies, as you can see here, were in crisis.
Are those numbers aggregate numbers for the EU? What
No, this is the
This is
advanced economies, emerging and developing economies, not on the
global?
Yes, exactly.
Is this approximately OECD, the advanced or OECD? Or?
The source is the IMF, so basically it's
IMF,
on the
okay.
IMF calculations
Yes.
on countries on advanced economies, emerging and developing. So basically I would say that this is like the global picture in the sense that it shows all the economies across the world based on the IMF division between advanced, emerging and developing economies. So definitely you can see that this was a truly global crisis. However, as you will see in this slide, although this was a crisis that affected economies across the world, some countries, again, countries in Southern Europe, the consumption-led economies, they paid a higher price. So you can see here Spain, Greece and Portugal that they faced a deeper recession than the rest of the Eurozone. Here is Germany and the Netherlands. So I would say that these countries, they rely primarily on, I would say, on contact-intensive sectors. So lockdowns hit these economies dramatically during the pandemic. So let's see now how the Eurozone responded to this new crisis. I would say that indeed we have seen a change. So definitely the European Union moved away from the austerity, the neoclassical austerity-driven approach that it took about a decade ago in 2009, 2008. So definitely we have the suspicion of the Stability and Growth Pact, meaning the suspicion of the strict fiscal rules. So this allowed governments to spend more in order to deal with the public health crisis, with the economic aspects and the economic consequences of the crisis. Also, the ECB used quantitative easing policies much earlier compared to the Eurozone crisis. And also for the first time we have, I would say, a centralized fiscal stimulus program, definitely much more dynamic than, as you will see in this figure, than the global financial crisis. So EU borrowed money from the capital markets and created the next generation EU, a 750 billion recovery fund to support economic recovery after the pandemic.
And it was mutually financed and mutually guaranteed.
Yeah, through the European Commission that basically borrow money on behalf of member states from the capital market. So here you can see exactly the difference. So during the global financial crisis, the EU fiscal stimulus program was about 1.5% of the EU GDP and increased about 7 times to about 10.5% in 2020. So definitely I would say that this illustrates a new approach, a more Keynesian or stimulus-oriented approach to deal with the crisis. So was this more effective this time? I would say that up to some extent, yes, in the sense that the crisis management prevented a prolonged recession in the Eurozone. Definitely economies recovered more quickly compared to the global, or how they recovered during the global financial crisis. Also, it was successful in maintaining the unity. Also, have in mind that we are after Brexit, so definitely this approach was more effective in keeping European economies together. However, I would say that the next generation EU was not effective enough or targeted enough in order to deal with the productive weaknesses I mentioned before in Southern Europe. So definitely, I would say that, as you also see, the macroeconomic imbalances in the Eurozone are still significant. So here you can see the gross debt in different European countries. So you can see that Greece, Portugal, Spain, they still have significant levels of public debt, and they are still at risk of potential crisis. So overall, let's see what really changed. So how the Eurozone managed, or basically what has changed after these two major crises. So I would say that indeed, let's move this to, yes, I would say that indeed we have seen a clear change from a neoclassical, austerity-driven approach to a Keynesian approach to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Definitely a more swift and effective monetary response. The ECB was in a position to act in a much more effective way. Definitely we have seen more fiscal stimulus than compared to the austerity policy that we have seen during the global financial crisis. And also the next generation EU, although it has been promising, although it has been a new step towards the European integration and more effective approach to deal with the crisis, it was not targeted enough to deal with the structural weakness in Southern Europe, and also it wasn't enough. I would say it was also not a permanent mechanism. So it was a one-off mechanism that's about also to end next year. So definitely I would say that the Eurozone remain fragile in the sense that the internal macroeconomic imbalances are still in rise. Definitely I would say also the political divisions, although they seem to be latent after the COVID-19 pandemic. If you see the negotiations, for instance, within the European Council, there are still significant debates, especially between the North and the South, about, for instance, the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact rules or the future of the next generation EU. So definitely I would say that still are there and remain unresolved. So overall, I would say that the book goes beyond the neoclassical and Keynesian perspective, and it brings more a structural perspective to understand what are the internal macroeconomic imbalances. And basically, I would say that it shows that indeed in both the neoclassical and the Keynesian responses of the crisis were not effective in making the Eurozone more resilient today, or making the Eurozone more effective in dealing with crisis. So I would say that indeed the Eurozone is still in a critical juncture. I would say that still internal divisions remain unresolved and could potentially spark new crises or political challenges in the coming months or coming years. Definitely we have seen a higher competition by the new US administration, also from China as well, that they can challenge the European economy. And I would say third, and even more most importantly, I would say that if the Eurozone continues in a path like this, definitely its role in the coming years will be less and less important in the global economy. And as this hourglass reminds us, the time is running out. So definitely the time for the Eurozone to act is now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Konstantinos. I think that was a very, very clear and also very efficient description of the book, which is quite useful to people. So I hope people will be able to see it. Okay, so let me say first of all that this is a very timely book because of the current economic scenario, a scenario where what central banks do, for instance, is going to be critical, as we're seeing right now here in the United States. That economies are only so robust when it comes to big, large economic shocks. And one of the perhaps striking things that we have actually seen in the last few weeks, right, is that the United States itself can even show some of the vulnerabilities that these countries that were put at a disadvantage in the Eurozone at the time of the Eurozone debt crisis following the great financial crisis, even the United States could possibly sort of ruin some of the advantages that it has, as we've seen recently in the problems with liquidity in U.S. Treasury markets. But nonetheless, the book is really about how different countries in the Eurozone are differently positioned, how some of the past responses have failed to address some of the fundamental problems with the Eurozone, and how this price has been paid in particular by countries that joined the Eurozone from a somewhat more disadvantaged position. Now, I did want to see if we could focus the discussion a little bit. There are a lot of interesting academic debates and theoretical debates that you raise, and I think your overall conclusion that there are some fundamental weaknesses in the Eurozone that have to do with how it is designed, in fact, and not just with the responses exactly at the crisis moment, but also how it is designed in normal times. How those affect us in the current present moment. And I wonder about two things. So one of the things that I haven't seen you address so much in this is the role of financial markets, which were very important at the moment of the Eurozone debt crisis, right? And then again, we saw at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, without going into the current international crisis, we saw at the very beginning that for a moment it looked like something similar, a seizing up of credit markets was about to happen. We do see as you pointed out, the ECB responding very differently, even though the design, the governance of the ECB has not been changed that much, right? And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of financial markets during the debt crisis. There was a lot of discussion of contagion, which is one of the things that kind of connected the individual crises of individual countries with the crisis or the response to the crisis in Greece, kind of producing first a crisis in Ireland, of course, and then the response to the crisis in Ireland contributing to the crisis in Portugal, and then in a way the crisis in Portugal kind of raising the specter of a crisis in Spain, and then that also becoming the crisis in Italy, kind of. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see the role of financial markets, and whether we could see something like this develop again in the present. And then I wanted to ask specifically about Greece and Portugal. Do I take it that you are an expert on Greece in part, or what do you make of the fact that in some way nowadays, and I completely agree with your view, your longer term view that you give us here, but with the fact that nowadays Greece is almost described as one of the the most functioning economies if you compare it to other Southern European economies.
Okay, great. So, Sofia, thank you very much. You raised several issues, but definitely I'll try to comment on all of them. First of all, as you said, indeed, there were significant voices about the problems in the Eurozone and the structure, the architecture of the Eurozone, even before the creation of the single currency in Europe. So definitely there were some aspects that have been criticized, especially the role of the European Central Bank. For instance, if you make a comparison between the single currency in the United States, because definitely you have a federal state, but also it's a single currency with 50 different states. But also if you see how the Eurozone is created, definitely there is like a currency union, but we have 20 different national states. So this practically means that we have the European Central Banks that decides a policy which is pretty much one-size-fits-all policy for all different countries. But at the same time, we have 20 different budgets in this economy. So this creates, as you can imagine, significant problems. Also, here in the United States, you have the same language, you have no borders across the 50 states. In Europe, it's completely different. So definitely here you have higher levels of capital mobility, higher levels of labor mobility across the country. So it's definitely much more easy to adjust in times of economic crisis or in times of economic shock. So definitely I would say some weaknesses of the Eurozone as a structure, as an architecture, were very clear from the beginning of this step of the creation of the euro. I would say still are relevant. Definitely we have seen some steps forward, but definitely I would say most of these weaknesses are still relevant, and for this reason the Eurozone is still very vulnerable to potential crisis. So in terms of financial markets, I would say definitely we all know how financial markets work. So I think it's more about the European Union to deal with financial markets in a better way. So for instance, we have seen the financial markets during the Liz Truss
in the UK.
Yeah, in the UK, or now in the United States. So definitely they have significant levels of power. They can somehow influence policies across the world, or even impose policies in different parts of the world. So I would say that it's more about the European Union, how could have reacted to the global financial crisis when the global financial crisis spread from the United States to the banking sector to Europe, to some major European banks in Germany, in France. So I would say that it was more up to the EU to react in a different way. So as we know, the ECB took, I would say, a very reactive approach. It took a lot of time for the ECB to play the role of the last resort, to intervene in the capital markets. This took place with Mario Draghi in 2012. So definitely these 3 years were critical time that has been lost until the ECB to use more, I would say, extensive quantitative easing policies to stabilize the Eurozone economy. So here you can see another difference on how the US reacted. I'm not saying that the reaction in the United States was like really without any issues. Definitely, I would say that there were significant problems also on how the US reacted to the crisis, especially after 2012. 13, we have seen more austerity-oriented policies, but definitely it was in the Eurozone. This was like a major issue. The role of the ECB was critical in in that time. So I would say that definitely the European Union should have taken a more effective approach, especially in dealing with financial market. As you said, we have seen the spread of the crisis as a contagion, so it was like a domino effect. So definitely if the ECB had reacted much earlier, this would have been prevented. However, I'm not saying that the only problem was the reaction of the ECB. The book makes the case of the structural dimension, even with the ECB reacting in a more effective and more swift way. I would say the macroeconomic imbalance, the structural weaknesses, and the divergence of the growth models of the economies of the Eurozone is a major issue. Is I would say the most important thing in order to that makes the Eurozone vulnerable to potential new crises. So I would say that definitely a more swift approach by the ECB would have made things better, but definitely there are structural issues that should have been taken into account in the future policies that they were implemented. And finally, in terms of how Greece is today, definitely I would say that in terms of fiscal policy, the economic situation has been stabilized. However, as the book argues, and it's not only about Greece, I would say that the peripheral economies, definitely it seems that some of the export-led economies like Germany or Netherlands and others, because of the high energy costs they had because of the war in Ukraine, also because they have also failed to invest in new technologies, in innovation. They are even Germany lagging behind the United States and China at this stage, so they have significant problems today. However, I would say this doesn't mean that the peripheral countries, because they seem to be more stable now that they have resolved, especially some productive weaknesses they have, and basically they still produce low added value, low tech products. The production is not competitive across the world. So definitely I would say that still the structural weaknesses are still in place. And again, it's up to the EU to create a more centralized approach to somehow try to decrease the macroeconomic imbalances within the union.
Right. So you see this as a persisting problem that even affects countries that might be temporarily kind of spoken up, because this is also the case with Spain, for instance. That right now Spain has higher growth than the Eurozone as a whole. I imagine that's true for Greece perhaps too right now, but that it's important to kind of look at this in terms of the longer term experiences.
Exactly. Definitely we have seen that some of these Southern European economies, they have like higher growth rates today, especially with compared to the EU average. But I think this is something potentially temporary, in the sense that the export-led economies in the north, they will at some point recover, or basically, as I said, I think it was primarily the high energy cost, definitely the low investment rates, even in these countries, that basically keep these economies in stagnation. But I think this not, or hopefully it's not gonna be like a permanent or a long-lasting trend. So I believe this will change. But again, I think the main issue that we have two different types of economies, two different types of growth models is very problematic. And this, I believe, will be visible very soon in a potential new crisis or in potential major event of financial stability. So this will be, I think, visible soon.
So I wanted to speak to that as well, because I think you explained very well that the various different states that adopted the euro had different historical growth paths, with some of them being very focused on exports as the main source of demand, or as a very important source of demand for its firms, and that relative role of external demand being less prominent in some of the other countries that joined. I did want to ask you whether one could look at this in a slightly different way. So whether sort of question the idea that these different countries are inevitably tied to these different types of growth models. And one reason for that, I would say, is that it has been argued that Germany, which is such a large share of the Eurozone in terms of the weight of its economy, in pursuing this export-led strategy, is doing something quite artificial, right? Because it's usually exports as a proportion of GDP is usually high in small states. So sort of a general rule, if you look across the countries of the OECD, is that small states, and there are even some political science arguments about why this is the case, if they specialize in their comparative advantages, if they followed that policy in the past, have to kind of rely on external demand because they need to import so many things. They cannot specialize in everything because they're a small state, right? So I wonder whether you'd be willing to say something about the appropriateness of Germany's export-led growth model, and if we do have a sort of a case of a large economy, which the German economy is relative to everyone else in that has the euro and the Eurozone, really following an appropriate growth strategy, and at the same time benefiting from the Eurozone, right? Because it has these the existence of the Eurozone in some ways keeps its the value of its currency lower than it would have if it was just a freestanding economy with such a big export surplus. So do you have any thoughts about that? And do we see change in regard to that, do you think?
First of all, I would say that indeed Germany has a very strong export sector even before the creation of the Eurozone. Definitely the single market was definitely something that allowed Germany to make more exports, basically reduce transaction costs and allow the German manufacturers to export more to the rest of the Eurozone and to the rest of the single market, European single market, and also even more with the single currency. So we have seen that after the creation of the Eurozone, if you see the data, there is a massive increase of the German exports, not only in the Eurozone, but also across the world, but I would say also within Europe. So definitely I would say that Germany took benefit of this approach. I'm not saying that having an export-led economy is like a silver bullet, in the sense that definitely you are somehow, I would say, vulnerable to potential external shock. We have seen this in many cases with some emerging economies that basically they rely primarily on export, definitely commodities as well, but also exports. They are very vulnerable to any potential crisis across the global economy. So definitely export-led economies are also vulnerable. But definitely I would say that I cannot see politically any way in which the German manufacturers or even the German government will surrender their export growth strategy that they do have in place, at least in the past few decades. So definitely I cannot see that they would like to pursue a more balanced growth by supporting domestic demand, by boosting domestic wages in order to create a more balanced growth model. I cannot see that politically. I think there is the role of the European Union. So definitely the EU should somehow intervene, potentially with a new strategy, with a new industrial policy that they could, which will potentially could balance or support the production capability in some of the southern European economies to allow them to export or basically to develop more competitive products, so to increase export. So definitely I would say that it's time. I think it's more up to the European Union to intervene in order to try to shrink this productive disparities and I would say the macroeconomic imbalance. So definitely the role of the EU is critical. There are definitely, I know that politically it's not something easy, but I would say also times are changing. So we have a completely new environment, global environment right now. I don't know how this will be in the next few months. So definitely it seems that there is like a trend in changing the global trade. So definitely I would say that it's time for the EU to take some bold responses, especially by creating, I would say, industrial policy that would allow to decrease internal macroeconomic imbalance, but also allow the economies to become more competitive in the global trade.
Right. I mean, and I do think it's important to point out that Germany itself also in 2010, when the decision was made to sort of opt for austerity, to impose austerity on the countries, which included Ireland, but the rest were in Southern Europe, that the German government at that time also imposed austerity in Germany, and that it didn't work out that well there, not only because of the current situation, which of course the German growth model was designed for the post-World War II free trade world order, right? And it's unclear how that's going to work in a very different world order. So it is important to remember that that this was a view that not only Germany, it has to be said, but Germany and some of its the other EU countries that also sort of fell into this morality tale of the problem having been lazy Southerners and too much spending, but that they also adopted austerity, and that even though Germany did relatively well to the rest of the Eurozone, which was one of the consequences of that response, that it also didn't do that well now in looked at a decade and some years later. So one can only hope kind of that the more general problem with that orthodox way of looking at economies will change in the medium term, so that some of these problems of the past can be addressed. Because I do agree with you very much that the situation is that of it's hard to say that now with the trade war going on, of a relative stability, as we saw, for instance, with people pulling out markets, pulling their money out from the U.S. stock market and investing it in European stock markets. But there is still this vulnerability in how the Eurozone is governed, and we don't know how that will turn out if, for instance, the trade war results in a financial war. So I think I might be getting...
Well, I don't understand why it's a vulnerability that all the economies don't function similarly if the risk is shared. I mean, was a new model established after COVID-19? Because if you have the situation of risk sharing, isn't it more parallel to the United States then? I mean, I understand the differences between the EU and the United States in terms of the borders and the languages and so on. But if you now have a risk-sharing model, why can't you have some economies that are more dependent on tourism and other economies that are more export-driven? I don't understand the problem if the risks are now shared.
Exactly. I'll come to this, but I would
Yes.
like to comment on what Sofia said before, and definitely I'll get to this point, which is an important one. So I would say that now it's more visible how the austerity or this ordoliberal approach of Germany basically reached its limit. So years of underinvestments across the European Union, also in Germany, basically I think that can now show us what are the results. So definitely, for instance, if you see, the bigger picture, if you see that the numbers, the European Union 30 years ago, it had about the same GDP with the United States. And now 30 years later, if you see the current data, you will see that EU has 30% lower GDP than the United States. So definitely I would say that these...
This is the EU as it with the 27 member states.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Okay, including the 27 member
Yes,
states.
if you see the long term, so this investment, this austerity-driven approach has reached its limits and definitely has been destructive for the European, even German growth model. So definitely both the EU, but also Germany, they're lagging far behind the main competitors in the global economy. So about the point about the setting of risk, I would say that indeed the Next Generation EU was quite a groundbreaking approach in the sense that for the first time the European Commission borrowed money from the capital markets on behalf of member states. So definitely this was an important moment. It was a step, I think, toward the right direction. But this mechanism somehow is not targeted enough. So basically it has like two broad directions, the digital and the green transition, which are definitely relevant and important in this period, in this era. However, I would say that we need a much more targeted approach in order to deal with specific weaknesses in each of the landing economies in Southern Europe. So definitely this is something needed. But also it's not like a pure risk-sharing approach in the sense that this was like a one-off mechanism in order to support recovery in the region, rather than a permanent mechanism of fiscal transfer that would, as you said, allow the economies to have different growth models and to specialize in different sectors, and at the same time to be able to support something like the federal government does in the United States. So it's definitely something like one-off mechanism that it's about to end next year, I think 2026. So definitely it's not like a permanent mechanism that would allow the fiscal transfer to support development even in times of crisis or other type of so definitely we are not there. And I had some interviews with some EU officials in Brussels for this book. So definitely where I was asking them about the extent to which the Next Generation EU could be a permanent mechanism or basically to work as a fiscal transfer mechanism to be able to share the risks across the EU. So basically it was striking that one of the top EU officials was saying that without a new crisis, this is impossible. So you can understand what is the mindset, the thinking within the top level of the European Commission. So definitely, I think we are far behind from having such.
Well, the EU got the new crisis coming, courtesy of the government in the United States. Okay, so that just on the last point, to also address Elizabeth's argument and agreeing with Konstantinos, there is some, there was some thought at the time of the COVID crisis and the creation of the Next Generation EU and the precedent of issuance of mutually guaranteed debt, that this could be like the moment at which European governments would understand or perhaps persuade their publics that some sort of common sharing could be made workable. But you're right. I mean, essentially, the focus has been on two main objectives, which I think is not in and of itself a bad thing, because there is a commitment to the green transition overall, and of course the other one, the digital transformation, is also something that European governments across the Eurozone and the EU are concerned about, and it's very much directed at investment in those areas. And there is no reason necessarily why investment in the green transition cannot also be a kind of industrial policy if it means that you are renewing technological infrastructure, right? Which will then serve the economy as a whole. So I think that there's nothing wrong with saying we want to allow governments to spend more if they spend it on these goals that there is some consensus on, because of course some people don't, there isn't a total consensus. I think the problem, the disadvantage that the EU still has vis-a-vis the United States, and that you so well just summarized in describing this long-term discrepancy in the growth of the EU versus the United States, is that they don't have the automatic fiscal mechanisms, right? So what they don't have is they don't have the common treasury, which will automatically raise more taxes from areas that are growing faster, and have that spending automatically end up in places that are growing slower. We have that in the United States. And so what that does is there is a single monetary policy in the United States, but these fiscal mechanisms balance that. And so it is true that the focus on investment, which is a good thing, and it's a form of demand, right? Does perhaps is kind of limiting on what the these new fiscal arrangements have been able to do. There's still a lot of hesitancy to have a real common treasury, a real common budget, and instituting balancing mechanisms that don't require political approval, that just kick in automatically when growth is slower in one area than another. So.
Yeah, definitely that's a very good point. So I think at the EU level we are far behind in reaching agreement on this. Definitely now it's a time of change, so definitely there are discussions and debate about these things. But I would say that definitely I cannot see that this will move forward like in the next, in the coming future. So I think that definitely needs more time. For instance, if you see the Mario Draghi report, which was published and basically has some new directions about how the EU and the Eurozone should move forward, basically, according to the estimates of this report, is that the EU needs about 800 billion in investments every single year. So this practically means that the EU needs a next generation EU every year. So what are the dynamics? And definitely I'm not sure, I'm quite skeptical about the extent to which national governments will be able to reach an agreement on something like this. So definitely, and also again from discussions at the top level of the EU commissions, there are some national governments that they are even concerns about the amount of money that is spent right now on innovation. So the focus now is more on defense, on migration issues. So definitely they are willing even to cut some of the spending and public investments in innovation, in new technology. So definitely this is somehow to give you what is again the thinking within the EU and the European Council.
Right. Okay. So if there are no other questions, I think that this was an extremely interesting talk and introduction to everyone to the problems of the EU and the Eurozone. And thank you everybody very much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.